Well, here it is, end of July, and I'm getting my food plot seed and fertilizer and stuff ready for my fall plots. Probably a good 3 weeks here before I start doing that, but I wanted to take a break and talk to you about really the two things now that hunting season is upon us that you can do this fall to increase your chances of taking a buck in 2 or 3 or 4 years from now. So looking ahead, what can you do this season to increase your chances on being consistent at harvesting bucks next year and 3 years and 4 years down the road? So I am always looking forward to next year and the year after that. Of course, I'm hunting this season, so I want to just dive right into the hunting for this season, and I want to enjoy that. But I'm always thinking about what are my actions doing to increase my odds of being successful every single year. And I don't want you to lose sight of that this fall. If that's your goal, is to harvest a mature buck, or have a chance at least of harvesting a big mature buck consistently every year. So there's two things that you can do looking forward. And actually, I would argue that one of them for sure is going to help you out this year. So the first thing you can do is, well, actually, before I get into that, I just want to take a step back. There's not much you can do now. It's end of July. There's really not much you're going to do for habitat. Nothing. I don't do anything for habitat improvement now, end of July. You can put in some green fall food plots. There's hunters out there that are putting in all kinds of different food plots, green, for the fall. I would argue food plots are probably a good thing to make your farm more attractive, so that deer select your farm and your hunting grounds more than the neighbors, which probably helps you protect some deer. But that's not really what this video is about. I would argue that you want to really set that food plot scheme up to be the most attractive during your primary gun season. So for me, that's a lot of corn and soybeans. So it's too late to be planting corn and soybeans end of July for grains. So really, what do you have to grow big bucks? Well, you need great habitat. You supplement that great habitat with some really good food sources that peak in attractiveness during that primary gun season. That's over. There's not much we can do about that yet. There's two more things you need to attract and hold and grow big bucks. The first is low hunting pressure, very low hunting pressure. So when you're getting into this hunting season, that's a strategy and a bunch of different tactics you can use to keep hunting pressure low on your farm. That's completely free, doesn't take any equipment, and it's all or primarily based off of your decisions on a day-to-day on how you hunt your property. So for me, it's just don't bump deer. On your way into your stand, while you're on stand, and while you're exiting your stand and going back to your vehicle or back to your home, if you're bumping deer on the way in, while on stand, or coming back, deer are getting downwind of you, deer are seeing you, deer are hearing you, you're bumping them. Some way you need to change what you're doing. So we talk a lot about morning hunts. So guys, and I'm one of them, guys will say you shouldn't hunt mornings early in the season. And the reason why I don't hunt mornings early in the season is not because it's not a good time to hunt mornings early in the season, or not because you can't kill a big buck on a morning hunt early in the season. It's because deer are so spread out in September and October. They're so spread out. Some deer are going to be back to bed. Some deer are going to be transitioning between food source and bed. Some deer will still be at the food source. Some deer will be randomly in waterways or cow pastures. They're everywhere in the early season. And there's really very little you can do to predict where these deer are going to be early in the season. They're so spread out. So no matter what time you're going in on a morning hunt, it seems to me you're bumping deer just because they're spread out. Now later in the year, by the end of October, it actually gets a little bit more predictable. More of the deer are back in their bedding area, and a lot of that has to do with us, because we bump them. If we've been hunting mornings, we bump them off food sources, or we bump them in their transition areas back to bedding, or we bump them close to bedding. So we've been bumping these deer. We put some pressure on them, and now they're back in their bedding area. More of them are back in their bedding area by sunup, which makes it easier to hunt mornings late October into November. If you're still bumping deer, if deer are still completely spread out into October and November, and they're not all back in their bedding areas at sunup, that's actually a good thing. That means that you have not put a lot of pressure on your farm, on the area that you're hunting, so deer feel comfortable still being completely spread out. And that's, for the most part, that's the kind of hunting that I have. I am just insane about keeping pressure low on the deer herd. So if my worst case, my definition of a really bad hunt is bumping a deer on the way in while on stand, or backing, when I'm exiting in the evening or in the morning. That's my definition of a bad hunt, because in my mind, I've just educated that deer, that doe family group, or that buck that I'm hunting, that they're getting hunted, and this is my entrance, or this is my exit, or this is where I am on stand. So keep that in mind. Keep hunting pressure as low as you possibly can. Another tactic I use, I have other videos on this, you can look it up, but I try to use all perpendicular access to my properties. So I shouldn't say never, but I want to avoid as much as possible walking down a fence line, walking parallel to cover for a length of time, 1 or 2 or 300 yards, where I'm walking this fence line parallel to cover. My plan when I hunt is I always like to come in perpendicular to where I'm going to hunt. So I'm using an area that deer are not going to frequent. So like a cow pasture, it can be agriculture fields when you're going into an evening stand, but maybe coming out, you have to find a different route. But coming in perpendicular, stopping at first sign, stopping at first movement of deer, and then keeping everything in front of you. And at the end of the hunt, you're down and you're back out with that perpendicular exit. So that to me is a critical strategy to maintain low hunting pressure on your deer herd, is using that perpendicular access. I know there's a lot of YouTube videos out there about, hunters will have a 40-acre piece and they'll only have access maybe along a road. So let's say that road is on the south end of the property. So if they want to hunt the east side of the property, or the west side of the property, or the north side of the property, there's a lot of habitat managers and consultants out there that say, well, you create these trails all on the border of your property for access. And I understand that concept, and I'm not against it, but just be mindful that if you're doing that, if you're exiting the road and you want to hunt that back line of your property, and it's a 40, for example, you have to walk parallel for 440 yards. 400 yards, you're walking parallel to cover to get to that back line. I think it's a far more effective strategy to just hunt your south edge a little bit more with northern winds, northwest winds on the east side, northeast winds on the west side, and just kind of give up that back portion. I don't like using parallel access at all. So that's another tactic you can use to keep hunting pressure low. Don't go into the center of your woods. Don't be checking cameras. I talked to a hunter here a couple months ago, and I'm not picking on the guy, I promise. But it's about 70 acres of private land, about 40 acres of cover. The rest was tillable. And this guy had, and you're gonna think I'm lying here. I want to say he told me he had 19 cameras where he had to check the SD cards, and 20 cell cameras on that 40 acres. So 39 cameras he had on that 40 acres. And he was routinely going in and pulling these SD cards and checking these cameras. I don't know, every single, maybe every week. And that's impossible to get in and check that many cameras covering this 40 acres without basically just driving out that entire 40 every single weekend when you're pulling these SD cards. So be careful when you're checking your cameras. On my cabin farm, it's 120 acres, 70 acres of cover, and I will probably run 3 cameras on that 120 acres this year. So that's, that maybe is another video, camera strategies, so you don't have to use so many. Behind the house here, I have 15 acres of cover. It's just a draw with some fingers, probably 2 cameras. So don't think that having 12 or 15 cameras, especially cameras where you're having to pull SD cards and you're going in and checking these cameras all the time, that's not helping you. That's actually a bad thing. You're putting pressure on deer. You're leaving scent behind. You're bumping deer while you're going in. They're busting you. They're seeing you. They're smelling you. They're hearing you. That's not a good thing. And then every time you hunt, just be aware of like where you're entering your property. I'll give you another example. Right behind the house here, we have a spot called South Ditch or South Fence Jump. And we figured out a couple years ago that if we take our Ranger or walk or drive a vehicle or anything to where we're entering, so the entrance is actually perfect for this tree stand, but just based on where we're parking and then walking in, we're kind of blowing up that hunt. So all we figured out to do a couple years ago was just take the Ranger or a vehicle and we're about 100 yards, we're turning left and we're going down the road, and then that's where we're parking, and then we're entering that stand or that set on an evening hunt. So making sure that your entrance, where you park your vehicle or where you park your UTV or something like that, maybe it's having a hunting partner or a spouse, drop you off and then keep going with a vehicle so that the deer aren't looking at that noise or seeing that UTV and associating with danger. So just kind of going back, if you're bumping deer, that's something that you can correct. And if you say, well, boy, my favorite stand, is timber stand A. That's my favorite stand. And it's in the center of my woods. And no matter how I go in, I'm always bumping deer, but it's my favorite stand, so how do I hunt it? And my answer to that would be you don't hunt it. You just don't hunt a stand like that. Another tactic I use to get in a little bit more difficult spots that are maybe a little bit farther in, so I use that perpendicular access, and then I want to hunt first sign or first activity and keep the deer in front of me. But I do have some stands where I'm in just a little bit from that, and I'll access those stands, let's say on a windy day. So on a really calm day where there's no breeze, I'll stay away from that stand. Now it's November and it's a morning hunt, but it's calm, I'll stay away from that stand. So I'll enter those stands on a morning or an evening when the wind is at 10 or 15 or 20 miles an hour. That's when I'll pick that stand because I can get in there and the wind will cover my entrance. So that's another tactic I use. Just always think in the back of your mind, if you're bumping deer, you have to change. Something has to change. And if there's no other way to get to that spot, there's no other way to hunt that spot, and they're still bumping you, then you have to abandon the spot. That would be my recommendation. That's what I would do. So that's the first thing you can do this year that's going to help you with this year's hunt, and it will help deer select your property more. They won't leave your property if they're not pressured on your property, which means you've just increased the chances that 1 or 2 or 3-year-old buck who selects your property on that day, even though maybe you can't hold them there, during the entire fall, but if they select your property more than they don't, that just increases your chances that deer won't get shot if you're letting them go. So the second thing that we can do, second thing that I do, is I create space for bucks so that I have a new batch of bucks continually for future years. So we know that bucks disperse when they're a year old and a year and a half old. So in the spring and in the fall of their first year. And because of GPS collar data, we know that as as much as 90%. There was one study I saw that was as much as 90% of bucks will disperse if their mother is still alive. They'll disperse from the maternal home range. And I think about half will do it in the spring and half will do it in the fall. We also know that the opposite is true if that doe is killed somehow. So maybe she's hit by a car, maybe she's harvested by a hunter, maybe predators kill her. So an orphaned buck, the opposite is true. They won't leave their maternal home range. So each fall, I'm doing two things. I want to make sure that I have space available on my farm so that bucks that are dispersing from 2 miles that way and 3 miles that way and from any different direction, and they're moving around and they're trying to find a new home range away from their maternal home range, I want to make sure my farm has the best habitat it has. Nothing you can do about that this fall. Supplement with food plots, but then I want low pressure on my farm, and I want to make sure that there's not so many deer on my farm that there's space that that buck can set up his home range on my farm. And I do that by killing some does. The second thing I'll do is if I see a doe come through and she has a buck fawn or twin buck fawns, that'll be the doe that I select to harvest if I have a choice. And the reason why, those buck fawns, there's a 90% chance that those buck fawns will not leave. They will set up their home range, or they will keep their maternal home range, which is already on my property. So the chances of those bucks now being killed go way down, because bucks that get dispersed, the mortality rate is much higher than bucks that don't get dispersed, and now I keep them on my property. Plus, by shooting that doe and orphaning those buck fawns, I've created space. So this is a very effective strategy, very, very effective strategy if you're hunting in an area with an average to above average deer population. And when I say area, county-wide or 10 or 15 square miles around you, if you have a really healthy deer herd, an above average to above average or really high deer population, the more does you shoot, the more buck fawns that you orphan, the more you're able to attract dispersing bucks to your property and keep bucks on your property that otherwise would have dispersed because you orphaned them by shooting that doe. So those are the two strategies that I'll be using this fall, two probably among many, that will help me next year and the year after and the year after attract bucks to my property and keep them on my property, and prevent buck fawns and year-and-a-half-old bucks, I should say buck fawns, prevent year-and-a-half-old bucks from dispersing this fall. They'll stay on my property. So I hope this video helps. I've been doing this a long time. And when I say this, I'm referring to I'm insanely probably over the top when it comes to putting pressure on the deer that I hunt. I want the least amount of pressure I can possibly put on them so that deer will select my property as much as I can possibly hope for, so I can protect bucks and grow them in the next age class. And then if I see a buck, or if I see a doe with twin buck fawns or a buck fawn, I'll do just about everything I can to shoot that doe. So I want to orphan as many buck fawns as I possibly can to create holes in my property for bucks to disperse and come on my property, and to keep those buck fawns here. That's going to set me up for next year and 2 years and 3 years from now. So the bucks that I'm hunting this year, I want to think that there's a high likelihood that the bucks that I'm hunting this year is because of what I did 3 years ago and 4 years ago by shooting some does and keeping pressure on my farm low 3 or 4 years ago, that allowed me to attract these bucks and keep these bucks on my farm that I'm hunting this year. So give that some thought and try those strategies and tactics during your hunting season this year, 2024. Good luck.